The whippoorwills stopped calling on the night Josiah Whitfield died, and nobody in the hollow noticed until 3 days later, when the silence itself became the loudest thing in the valley. It should not have been strange. A man dies in the summer of 1863, and grief has a way of swallowing small details. The ordinary sounds of a place go unheard while people are busy with harder things. But whippoorwills were not a small detail in that part of the Ozarks. They were the sound the whole valley slept to, every dusk from April through September, calling their own name over and over, from the tree line until full dark. Josiah's widow, Naomi, said later that she hadn't realized how much she depended on that sound until it was gone. Until the nights turned so quiet, she could hear her own heartbeat and nothing else. By the second week, Elam Sutter, who had farmed the next ridge over for going on 40 years, walked down to the Whitfield place to ask Naomi if she'd heard them either. She hadn't. Neither had anyone else he'd asked. Whatever had gone quiet, it hadn't gone quiet in one yard. It had gone quiet across the whole hollow all at once. The same night Josiah was buried. Josiah Whitfield had been a timberman, not a farmer. One of a small crew that felled and hauled for a logging outfit working the ridges above Coldwater Creek. The kind of work that paid better than farming most years, but asked more of a man's luck in return. He'd died the way timbermen sometimes did. A hung tree came down wrong, and by the time the others got to him, there was nothing left to do but carry him home. He was 31. Naomi buried him on a Thursday in a family plot behind the house, the ground still soft from a wet spring, with Elam Sutter standing beside her, because there wasn't anyone else left on that side of the family to stand there instead. The minister spoke briefly. Most of the valley came, the way it did for any death, and left before dusk without anyone remarking that the evening felt unusually quiet. Grief has a way of making an ordinary silence feel deserved. She noticed the quiet that same night, though she didn't understand yet what she was noticing. She lay awake past midnight from grief, not habit, and it was only somewhere in that sleepless dark that she realized what was missing. No calling from the woods, no answering call from farther off, the way there always was. One bird taking up the cry after another until the whole ridge seemed to be talking. Just her own breathing and the house settling, and nothing else. She told herself it was one bad night. Birds go quiet sometimes, a storm coming, a fox working the tree line, any number of ordinary reasons. But the next night was the same, and the next. By the end of that first week, she had stopped telling herself it would resolve on its own. She remembered, oddly, that the night before Josiah died had been an ordinary one. The birds calling the way they always did, while he sat on the porch mending a strap for his boots, in no particular hurry to be anywhere else. She hadn't thought to notice it at the time, the way a person never thinks to notice an ordinary evening until it becomes the last one they can clearly remember. It was only afterward, lying awake to a silence with no explanation, that the memory of that last ordinary night took on a weight it hadn't asked for. Elam Sutter had lived on that ridge long enough to remember 3 different generations of whippoorwills, if birds could be said to have generations a person kept track of. He didn't believe in omens exactly, though he'd grown up around people who did, and he was careful never to say the word out loud in front of Naomi. What he told her instead, standing in her yard with his hat in his hands, was more practical than that. Something's changed up the creek, and the birds know before we do. Neither of them could explain, in the first weeks, what he meant by that. It became the thing they returned to instead of an answer. Naomi asked around. She asked the minister, who offered the sort of comfort that didn't require an explanation. That grief plays tricks on the ear. That the mind fills silence with meaning it doesn't have. She asked the trappers who worked the creek bottom in winter, men who would have noticed if a fox or a wildcat had moved through and scattered every nesting bird in the hollow. They hadn't seen a sign of it, no fresh kills, no torn nests, nothing to explain a silence that size. She asked a woman 2 farms over whose husband kept bees, on the thought that maybe something in the air itself had turned, smoke, blight, some sickness moving through the trees. The woman only shook her head and said her bees seemed fine, busier than usual if anything. A hunter who worked the ridge above the Whitfield place told her he'd stopped hearing the wood thrushes too, though only the whip-poor-will's absence had been sharp enough for most people to name outright. Nobody organized a search the way they might have for a missing person. There was nothing to search for. No tracks, no carcasses, no sign that anything violent had passed through the hollow. Just an entire species of bird that had, as far as anyone could tell, simply declined to come back. Naomi walked the tree line herself more than once that first fall, listening for anything at all, a single call, a rustle that might explain itself as an answer. She found only the ordinary sounds a woods makes without birds in it. Wind moving through dry leaves, a branch settling, her own footsteps loud in a quiet that should have belonged to something else. She came home each time no closer to an answer, though she kept walking out anyway. The way a person keeps checking a door they already know is locked. The one detail every account agreed on was the timing. Whatever had happened, it had happened everywhere in the hollow the same night, not gradually across a season the way a die-off from sickness or drought usually spread. That detail bothered Elam more than anything else in it. Sickness moved slow. Whatever this was hadn't. Word of the silence traveled past the hollow itself by that first autumn. Travelers passing through on the road to the mill mentioned it in other valleys, the way any strange thing eventually gets carried farther than the place it happened. A few came out of simple curiosity, walked the tree line at dusk to hear the nothing for themselves, and rode on none the wiser. Naomi found she didn't mind the visitors as much as she expected to. It was, in its way, easier to have strangers confirm the silence than to keep explaining it to people who already half believed her. By fall, the hollow had settled on its own competing explanations, the way a valley does when nobody has a real answer to offer. The older families leaned toward the birds mourning a good man, the same way a dog was sometimes said to grieve. A few of the church women thought it was closer to a warning than a mourning, that something else had gone wrong that summer besides one death, and the silence was simply the shape the warning took. The men who worked timber alongside Josiah didn't say much on the matter at all, which Naomi noticed more than any theory offered outright. Whatever they knew about that spring's work, none of them volunteered it. Naomi found she had little patience, that first year, for any of the theories being offered to her secondhand. She wanted an answer that came from watching the thing itself, not one repeated at her from a porch or a pew. It was that impatience, more than anything, that pushed her toward Elam's slower, more careful way of not quite answering. His willingness to say only what he'd actually seen and nothing he hadn't. She kept a small notebook that first winter, marking each evening whether she'd heard anything at all. Most pages held a single word, written the same way night after night. Nothing. She stopped keeping it by spring, not because she'd lost interest, but because a record that says the same thing every day stops being a record of anything worth keeping. By late summer, Elam had taken to walking the creek bottom with her some evenings, the two of them looking for anything that might explain what neither of them could name. They checked the shallows for the usual signs of trouble: dead fish, a sheen of something on the water, mud stirred up wrong. They found nothing. The creek looked, to both their eyes, like an ordinary creek in an ordinary summer. It was only slower than Naomi remembered it being the summer before, though she couldn't have said by how much or whether her memory of a creek's speed from one year to the next could be trusted at all. In the second summer, Elam tried something more deliberate. He'd heard that whippoorwills sometimes could be drawn back to a place by imitating their call at dusk, and he spent the better part of a week standing at the tree line at the hour they should have been calling, doing his best at a sound he'd heard his whole life, but had never once had reason to make himself. Nothing answered. He never told Naomi how foolish he'd felt doing it, only that it hadn't worked, and that he didn't intend to try it again. If stories like this find you on the road home, subscribe and ride along. New stories every week, waiting at the trailhead. It was Elam who eventually gave her something more solid to hold on to, though it took him most of the fall to get around to saying it plainly. Whippoorwills, he told her one evening in October, didn't feed the way most people assumed. They weren't picking at seed or grain. They hunted moths and beetles on the wing at dusk, low over water and open ground, and they needed a particular kind of insect life to do it. The kind that bred thick along a slow-moving creek bottom, where the water stayed warm enough into the evening to draw them out. If something changed the creek itself, its speed, its temperature, what lived and bred in it, the insects would thin out before anyone thought to look for them. And the birds that depended on those insects would go somewhere else to find a living. Or they wouldn't come back at all. Naomi didn't ask him at first why he was telling her this instead of simply saying he didn't know. She was learning by then that Elam Sutter's way of not knowing something was to talk around it carefully until the shape of an answer came into view on its own, without him ever quite claiming to have found it. What came into view that winter was Coldwater Creek itself, and the timber outfit working 2 ridges up from where it started. The outfit had dammed a narrow stretch of the creek that spring, not far above the Whitfield place, to pool enough water for driving logs down to the mill in high water. It was common work, the kind no one thought twice about. A splash dam, built to be opened later and let go all at once, sending a rush of logs downstream on the flood it created. Every timber crew on that stretch of the Ozarks built them the same way, and had for years, without anyone remarking on what it did to the water above the dam in the meantime. How it backed the creek up into something closer to a still pond than a running stream, for as long as the outfit needed the head of water to hold. Naomi hadn't paid it any attention when Josiah first mentioned the job that spring. It was simply where the work was that season, the same as any other year. Splash dams were rarely built to last. An outfit put one up for as long as a season's cutting required, used it to move logs downstream in a single controlled flood, and left it standing afterward more from indifference than intention. Tearing one out cost labor nobody was paid to spend once the timber contract itself had ended. Naomi hadn't known any of that until Elam explained it to her. Standing at the creek's edge with his hat in his hands again, the same as he'd stood in her yard the week Josiah died. It was, he said, simply how the business worked. Nobody built a splash dam thinking about the years after the logs were gone. They built it thinking about that one flood, that one season, and moved on to the next stretch of ridge as soon as the contract allowed. She found the timber outfit's own ledger among Josiah's things that winter. going through his effects the way a widow eventually has to. The small box of tools, a coat still smelling faintly of pine sap. Papers he'd never thought to explain to her because there'd been no reason yet to think he wouldn't be the one to explain them himself. The ledger listed the crew by name, the contracted work, the dates paid against the days worked. Josiah's name was there in April, on the crew that built the dam, the same dam she now understood, that had slowed the creek to something close to standing water for half a mile above her own house, all through the summer that followed. She sat with that ledger a long time before she told anyone what she'd found, turning it over on her lap without opening it again, as if the second reading might change what the first one had already told her. It was one thing to accept that the birds had gone somewhere else, because a creek had changed. It was another thing to understand that her own husband's hands had helped change it. That whatever had driven the whip-poor-wills away, he had been part of building it, months before the same work, in a different way, took him too. When she finally showed the ledger to Elam, he read it twice before he said anything at all. Then he only asked her what she wanted to do with that knowing now that she had it. She didn't have an answer. She kept the ledger anyway. She walked up to see the dam itself that same winter, something she hadn't done in the 2 years since Josiah died, though it stood less than an hour's walk from her own door. It was smaller than she'd imagined it. A low wall of stacked logs and packed earth, no higher than a man's chest, holding back water that had gone still and dark above it, skinned with a thin sheet of ice at the edges. Below the dam, the creek ran the way a creek should, chattering over stone, catching the winter light. Above it, nothing moved at all. She stood there a long while, trying to decide whether the stillness felt like something wrong or simply like water doing what water does when it's told to stop. She couldn't decide. She only knew that Josiah had stood on that same bank, working with his own hands, in the last spring he was alive, and that the water had likely looked much the same to him then as it did to her now. Unremarkable, the way most work looks unremarkable to the people doing it. She didn't tell Elam she'd gone. It felt, for reasons she couldn't fully name, like something she needed to have done alone. Nobody in the valley could tell her, with any certainty, that the dam explained the birds at all. Elam wouldn't claim more than a theory. He'd think about a slowed creek and a summer of silence, he told her, and it made a kind of sense to him. But he'd also known creeks to change for a season and put themselves right again the next, birds and all, for reasons nobody could ever pin down after the fact. He had no way to test what he believed. He only had what he'd watched with his own eyes for 40 years on that ridge. And what he'd watched didn't match this. The dam stood through that first silent summer, and through the one after it. Naomi kept expecting, each spring, that the calling would start up again on its own, the way ordinary disruptions usually resolved. It didn't. 2 years became 3. 3 became 5. Somewhere in there, most of the hollow simply stopped mentioning it, not because anyone had explained it, but because a silence long enough eventually stops sounding like an absence and starts sounding like the ordinary shape of things. Nobody had torn the dam out, and nobody, in 5 years, had bothered to ask, why not? In the 3rd year, one of the men who'd worked the crew alongside Josiah came through the hollow on his way to timber further west and stopped at the Whitfield place, more out of old obligation than any particular news to bring. He hadn't come to talk about the birds. He seemed surprised, in fact, that anyone still did. But Naomi asked him about that spring anyway, about the dam, about whether Josiah had said anything at the time about the work. The man thought about it a while before answering. Josiah hadn't liked the job much, he finally said, not the danger of it, which no timberman complained about outright, but the waiting. Building a dam meant weeks of slow, unglamorous labor before the one good flood that made it worth doing, and Josiah had said more than once that he'd rather be back on the ridge felling than standing in cold water stacking logs for a flood that hadn't come yet. The man didn't know what to make of the silence himself. He only remembered that detail because Naomi had asked. And it was the kind of thing a man says once and never again, until somebody troubles to ask. He didn't stay the night. He rode on west the next morning, and Naomi never saw him again after that, though she thought of what he'd told her more often than she expected to. That the man she'd married had stood in that same cold water, resenting the slowness of a job that would, in ways neither of them could have known, outlast him by 9 years. Naomi noticed that part more than most. It would have been simple enough, in theory, for the outfit or anyone else to pull the structure apart and let the creek run the way it had before. No one did. It wasn't spite, and it wasn't neglect exactly. The outfit had moved on to timber further up the ridge years earlier and had no reason left to think about a dam they no longer used. It simply sat there, doing nothing to anyone, while an entire species of bird stayed gone on account of it. In the 5th year, she heard one. She was certain of it for the rest of her life, though she never told more than a handful of people, and even then, only carefully. A single call, low and unmistakable, from somewhere down near the creek. One warm night in June. She sat up in bed and waited for the answer that should have followed, the second bird taking up the cry the way they always had. Nothing came. She lay awake until it was light out, listening for a repeat that never arrived, and by the next evening she had half convinced herself she'd dreamed it. The way grief and hope both have a way of manufacturing the thing a person most wants to hear. She walked down to Elam's place the following morning anyway, and told him what she thought she'd heard. He didn't tell her she was wrong. He only asked if she'd heard a second call after it, and when she said no, he said that a single bird passing through wasn't the same as the birds coming back, that it might have been one young one testing new ground, lost or curious, gone again by morning. It never called again that summer or the next. Naomi never decided whether she'd heard a real bird or only wanted to badly enough to imagine one. She kept the not knowing to herself more carefully than she kept most things. In the 6th year, a traveling naturalist passing through on his way to Springfield heard about the silent hollow from a store owner and rode out to see the creek for himself. He took measurements of the water's speed and temperature, noted the thinness of insect life along the banks compared to a healthy creek bottom, and told Naomi before he left that everything he'd seen supported Elam's theory well enough, though he was careful to say supported rather than proved. And Naomi noticed the difference even if he hadn't meant her to. He wrote none of it down for publication. He simply rode on toward Springfield, and the hollow went back to being nobody's particular concern but its own. She never left the house, though people asked her why she stayed on a farm with no husband and no bird song, and no reason left to keep either. She told the few who asked that she wasn't waiting for the whip or wills to come back. She was only waiting to see, one way or another, whether they would. The dam broke on its own in the spring of the 9th year, during a flood that took out half the crossings on Coldwater Creek and reshaped the creek bed for a quarter-mile below where it had stood. Nobody meant for it to happen that way. It had simply aged past what its builders intended. Timbers rotted through, pinned logs finally giving way under a spring rise heavier than the structure had ever been built to hold. The way splash dams eventually did once the outfit that built them moved on to other timber, and stopped tending the structure at all. Naomi heard the break from her own porch, a sound like distant thunder that didn't stop when the thunder should have. By morning, the creek below the old dam site was running higher and faster than she'd ever seen it, carrying loose timber and torn brush down past the house in a brown, churning rush that took 2 days to settle back into anything resembling its old banks. That was the spring the whippoorwills came back, not gradually, not one bird testing the silence and the others following slowly over a season, but all at once, the way they had gone quiet in the first place. Naomi said she woke one night in May to a sound she had almost forgotten how to recognize, coming from every direction at once, as though the whole hollow had simply resumed a conversation it had set down 9 years before. She asked Elam once whether he thought the dam breaking truly explained it. He said he thought it probably did, in the way most things in a life probably explained each other, without ever quite proving it. What he couldn't account for, he told her, wasn't the leaving. Creeks changed, insects thinned, birds went elsewhere to feed. None of that troubled him. It was the returning that stayed with him. Not gradual, not one bird testing the silence and the rest following over a season the way you'd expect if they were simply drifting back as conditions allowed. But all of them, the same week, as if something in the whole population had been keeping a kind of count of the entire 9 years, waiting not merely for water to run again, but for enough of it to return that the valley was, in whatever way birds measured such things, whole again. He had no way to test that. He only had what he'd heard with his own ears, the same ridge, the same spring, after 9 years of nothing. Naomi lived on that farm another 20 years after the birds returned. She never remarried. She kept Josiah's ledger in a drawer in the front room, and people who visited sometimes asked to see it, as though the handwritten list of names and dates could somehow explain more than it did. It couldn't. It only showed that a man had built something in the spring before he died, without knowing what it would cost the valley, or that it would take 9 years for the valley to forgive it. Some in the hollow still say the birds left in mourning, and came back only once the grief had run its course, the way people eventually do. Others say it was never about mourning at all, that Elam Sutter had the plain truth of it, and the whole business was water and insects and nothing more, dressed up afterward in a story because silence needs a reason and people would rather have a sad one than an ordinary one. A handful still hold to the naturalist's measurements as the last word on it, though even he never claimed more than that the numbers fit. A few of the oldest families still call it the year the valley held its breath, though nobody living can say exactly who said that first, or why the phrase took hold the way it did. Naomi Whitfield is buried now beside her husband, behind the house that still stands on that ridge above Coldwater Creek. Some evenings, if you sit still enough near dusk, you can hear them calling from the tree line. One bird taking up the cry, and then another, farther off, answering back into the dark.